Environmental racism in our society. Where is it in our education system? Who is speaking out about it? There are many places around the world where poverty, economic insecurity, and racial and ethnic inequality converge to disadvantage communities of color. In Mexico, the state of Chiapas is home to the largest indigenous populations in the country. It is also its poorest region, suffering from 75% poverty rate. Xochitl Cruz, an 8-year-old girl living in Chiapas, built a solar-powered water heater because her family is one among many without access to reliable running water in this region. Xochitl saw the environmental crisis that her community was going through, resorting to cutting down trees to build fires because they are unable to afford heaters, and decided to build a water heater from easily accessible and recyclable materials that, quote, don't hurt the environment. Now, I want you to think about the first time you heard the term environmental racism. Was it in middle school? In high school? Now think about the first time you heard racism or environmental activism. Chances are you heard these two much earlier than the first. Why is that? Well, I'm here to talk to you about it. I remember learning about reduce, reuse, recycle in elementary school, as well as the beginning of long lessons about racial injustice in our country's history. But anything combining the two is something I don't actually think I learned about, and if I did, the fact that I can't remember is still problematic. As I was reading these articles about environmental racism, I knew this information seemed familiar, but that was about it. So here are some facts about what's going on in America today. On average, people of color face a 28% higher health burden compared to the general population, thanks to living in proximity to facilities emitting particulate pollution like soot, while Black people specifically suffer a 54% higher health burden. This means that they are at greater risk of developing health problems like asthma, heart disease, and even lead poisoning, depending on the dangerous waste and pollution that exists in their areas. Studies have found that race is often a more reliable indicator of proximity to pollution than income alone. This means that the greatest factor indicating poor conditions of a community is race and not poverty. We all heard about Flint, Michigan, and how the city's decision to switch its drinking water supply from Detroit's system to the Flint River not only contaminated the water because of the corrosive river, but also elevated blood lead levels in the city's children and led to an outbreak of Legionnaire's disease from all the waste dumped in the river by nearby factory plants and facilities. We were told that this is a community of predominantly Black people suffering from a lack of resources and an overabundance of unclean water. But nowhere in all the media coverage it received did the term environmental racism appear prominently. So what does all of this mean? What is environmental racism? Environmental racism, as defined by African American civil rights leader Benjamin Chavis, is racial discrimination in environmental policymaking, the enforcement of regulations and laws, the deliberate targeting of communities of color for toxic waste facilities, the official sanctioning of the life-threatening presence of poisons and pollutants in our communities, and the history of excluding people of color from leadership of the ecology movements. Not as simple as you think. You see, when I heard environmental racism, I thought about two things: poor communities of color and polluted resources. I didn't think about policymaking or the exploitation of certain populations, even though these are national and global issues. So why did I not connect them to environmental racism? Well, I had a few theories. One was that even though I grew up in a poorer area of Los Angeles filled with mostly Latinx people, but not somewhere affected by a nearby chemical plant or illegal mining sites, it was not an essential topic to learn about. But then I thought, even though I probably didn't have to worry about anything more than city smog, did that somehow make it reasonable to not be taught about what other children face in other parts of the country? My second theory was that I had learned about it. I learned about the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico and how it is still affecting ocean wildlife. I learned about other disasters occurring in the world that were similar enough for me to understand that it was something of a common occurrence in those places. But then again, that's not exactly what environmental racism is. My final theory was that I had all the components. I learned about how people of color were confined to the slums of cities when our country was developing, and that these areas have remained largely the same. And I learned about how the slums of industrial cities were submerged in toxic air and chemicals. Maybe I was just unable to put the pieces together myself, and that was on me. But I finally came to the conclusion that it was all of these things combined. Because of where I grew up, there were different pressing issues that were deemed more important and therefore were the ones implemented into our school curriculums. I do vaguely recall reading certain articles discussing massive hazardous waste in locations affecting people of color. However, without enough attention to these topics, I was unable to grasp how these issues were related to environmental racism, as I'm sure many of my peers have been unable to unless directly taught about this societal problem growing up. It is concerning that we are not dedicating enough time in schools to educate younger generations about environmental racism and its disastrous and deadly outcomes. Of course, I understand that small children may not be able to comprehend the complexities of environmental racism, but I strongly believe that they should be taught about this injustice well before high school. I anticipate arguments would be made that children should not worry about adult problems, or even that they have no real conception of how these issues exist in society. To this I say, we must also keep in mind that there are many young people who have shown that they can take matters into their own hands. Children like Xochitl Cruz prove that youth are innovative and eager to learn, and that they want to make the world a better place. For this reason, environmental racism should be brought into the classroom sooner so that youth can understand the unfair treatment certain groups undergo. Reduce, reuse, recycle is not enough to bring justice to communities that are disproportionately affected by pollution and toxic waste because of their race or ethnicity. Yes, Xochitl may not have understood the racialized aspect of her work, but in creating her solar-powered water heater, she aided the indigenous populations of our country who are poverty-stricken in part due to their native heritage. She took what she learned in her elementary science classes and improved the living conditions of her community. It is also important for us to learn and discuss historical and contemporary examples of environmental racism. This includes understanding how events like the founding of the United States and the Civil Rights Movement should not be taught through frameworks that exclude environmental issues. We are taught that indigenous Native Americans being kicked off of their land was a racial injustice fueled by the pursuit for economic gain without recognizing how this also falls under the category of environmental racism. We are taught that civil rights activists were fighting for equal treatment and protection under the law between the races, but failed to acknowledge the strive for greater workplace agency and recognition that people of color demanded, as well as greater opportunities for them to make decisions that would affect the conditions of their own communities, like where landfills should be built and how many trees there should be. We see examples all around us but are unable to notice them for what they truly are: environmental degradation by manufacturing and energy-producing industries imposed upon people of color. It is true that natural disasters and climate change do not affect us all the same, but that does not mean we should let those who are affected the most do all the work for justice. In a world that is wholly affected by global warming, and many people argue for that, why is environmental racism ignored? We should know that Black Americans breathe 56% more pollution than they produce, and Latinos breathe 63% more, while whites breathe 17% less and decide to do something about it. We should not be content with people of color living in dangerous health conditions because they deserve basic resources like clean water and clean air. We should not be content with white advocates frontlining these issues in the media and in the political scene, and that the percentage of minorities in leadership positions in U.S. environmental organizations is less than 12%, because there cannot be a discussion of a better quality of life for people of color without the voices of people of color explaining the unfair realities in their communities, in their workplaces, and in virtually any other area of life. There are already young voices speaking for better policies to protect their communities of color from exploitation by large companies. Most of these advocates began their work because they already have first-hand experience with the struggles of the economic inequality and racism that is facilitated and sustained by nearby air pollution, toxic waste facilities, and other such dangerous conditions. But to be able to push for change, they need allies in other communities, states, and countries to support them in the pursuit of racial and environmental justice. It is a collective effort, and we must all do our part. Thank you.